My son cut me off for 14 years, then suddenly invited me to Christmas the day after my millions made headlines. "We're so glad you could finally make it, Dad," he said. I smiled and placed a sealed envelope beside his dinner plate. A while later, my son's face went pale as he saw what was inside. What do you think was inside that envelope? Before we continue, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, crisp white cardstock with golden embossing that caught the light just so. David's handwriting, still as neat as when he was 8 years old, traced across expensive paper. "Dad, we'd love to have you join us for Christmas dinner this year. It's been too long." Too long. 14 years, 3 months, and 8 days to be exact. I set the invitation on my mahogany desk next to the newspaper clipping that had started it all. Local man turns tech investment into $27 million fortune. The reporter had done their homework, found my old construction photos, my wife Helen's obituary from 1998. They'd painted quite the picture. Widowed father builds empire from nothing. I reached for my phone. Marcus Rodriguez, my private investigator, answered on the first ring. "Mr. Walker, I saw your interview yesterday. Congratulations on going public with your business success. Are you calling about the invitation?" Marcus had been helping me with some business matters for the past few years, though today felt different. "What's your gut telling you about this sudden reunion?" I asked. "Same as yours, I'd bet. The timing's too convenient. Your wealth goes public, and suddenly you're welcome at the family table." Marcus paused, and I could hear papers shuffling. "I've been watching their lifestyle like you asked. New BMW in the driveway, expensive renovations on the house, private school tuition for Emma. Living pretty well for a freelance designer and an engineer." I closed my eyes, seeing Helen's face the way she looked in our last Christmas photo together, taken just months before she passed away when David was 17. After she died, David became a stranger in our own house. He stopped talking to me, stopped eating family dinners, and spent his senior year in a cloud of grief and anger that I couldn't penetrate no matter how hard I tried. When he left for college the following fall, he barely said goodbye. The silence that followed stretched into months, then years, until it became a chasm too wide to cross. Marcus cleared his throat. "About the invitation, sir. My sources say it was Natalie's idea. She saw the newspaper article about your tech fortune and convinced David that Emma deserves to know her wealthy grandfather. According to what I overheard, she told him that with your newfound success, maybe it was time to let bygones be bygones, especially since you could now help secure Emma's future." "So it was about the money," I said, though I'd already suspected as much. David seemed genuinely conflicted about reaching out, but Natalie kept pushing, saying Emma's been asking questions about why she doesn't have a grandfather like her friends. She made it sound like a Christmas miracle, reuniting the family just when you'd achieved the success to provide for them properly. I thought about Emma, the granddaughter I'd never been allowed to meet. Now 8 years old with what I imagined were Helen's delicate features and David's stubborn chin. Every year on her birthday, I'd bought a gift and left it in my closet, hope fighting against the reality that I might never give them to her. "Yes," I told Marcus, "it's time." After hanging up, I walked to my safe and retrieved 2 envelopes I'd prepared weeks ago, back when I first suspected this invitation might come. The first was from First National Bank, official bank statements that would serve as the opening move. The second contained photographs and documents that would change everything between us, evidence that would either rebuild our relationship or destroy it completely. I glanced at the framed photo on my desk. Helen holding baby David, both of them laughing at something I'd said behind the camera. "Help me do the right thing here, sweetheart," I whispered to her image. "Help me get our boy back." The weight of 14 years of silence pressed down on my shoulders. 14 years of missed birthdays, school plays, scraped knees. I couldn't kiss better? Bedtime stories I couldn't read. 14 years of loving from a distance, of supporting my family through channels they didn't even know existed. As evening approached, I made one final call to Marcus. "Are you certain about the timing? Everything has to unfold perfectly tonight." His voice carried the confidence of a man who'd spent 30 years uncovering truth. "Mr. Walker, Trust me. By the time dessert is served, your son will know exactly who his father really is." The drive to David's house took me through Christmas Eve traffic, past decorated storefronts and families hurrying home with last-minute gifts. I used the time to rehearse what I would say, how I would handle their reactions when they discovered the truth. But underneath the planning, something else churned in my stomach. What if this backfired? What if David chose Natalie's lies over his father's love? The neighborhood looked exactly as I remembered it from my careful drive-bys over the years. Tree-lined streets with modest but well-maintained homes, the kind of place where families raised children and built memories. David's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, distinguishable from its neighbors by the professional landscaping and the gleaming BMW in the driveway. Both improvements I'd unknowingly funded through my monthly payments to Natalie. Whatever happened tonight, I would face it with the same integrity I'd tried to model for David throughout his childhood. Helen would have been proud of that choice, I thought. She'd always said revenge was a poison you drink hoping someone else gets sick. But this wasn't about revenge. This was about truth, about love, about a father's desperate attempt to reclaim the relationship that had been stolen from him. I sat in my car for a moment longer, watching the warm light spill from the windows, listening to the distant sound of Christmas music playing inside. Somewhere in that house was my granddaughter, a little girl who didn't know her grandfather existed, who'd been raised on lies about why her father's family was incomplete. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years building a business empire, accumulating wealth that now made headlines, yet the only treasure I truly wanted was sitting just beyond that front door, my family. All the success in the world meant nothing if I couldn't share it with the people I loved most. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out into the cold December air and walked toward the front door, carrying with me the weight of 14 years of silence and the hope that tonight might finally break it. The suburban house looked exactly as I remembered it from my occasional drive-bys, except for the new BMW in the driveway and the professionally landscaped front yard that replaced the simple grass and bushes from years past. My anonymous payments had been put to good use, I noted with bitter satisfaction. The Christmas lights twinkling along the roofline probably cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. The doorbell echoed through the house, followed by the sound of excited footsteps. The door swung open, and there stood my son, for the first time in 14 years. David had Helen's warm brown eyes and my stubborn chin, though his face had filled out and lines creased around his eyes that spoke of years I hadn't been part of. For just a moment, seeing him again threatened to derail everything I'd planned. This was my boy, the child I'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager who'd helped me build that treehouse Helen had sketched out on a napkin during one of her last good days. "Dad?" His voice carried genuine surprise and what looked like pleasure. "You made it. You look incredible. Really successful." His eyes took in my expensive suit, the confident posture of a successful man. "Come in. It's cold out there." The house smelled like cinnamon and roasting turkey, exactly the way Helen used to make Christmas dinner. The familiar scent hit me like a physical blow, bringing back memories of happier times when our family was whole. Family photos lined the hallway, and I searched each frame desperately for any sign of myself. There were none. It was as if Alan Walker had never existed in this family's history, as if David's father had simply vanished from the story they told themselves about their lives. But there, in the living room, hung a 42-inch television that I recognized, not because I'd seen it before, but because I'd anonymously purchased it last Black Friday when David mentioned to Natalie in passing that theirs had broken. The coffee table was new too, solid oak instead of the pressboard they'd been using. The leather recliner in the corner bore the same stamp as the one I'd researched and had delivered for David's 30th birthday, though he'd never known where it came from. "Natalie, he's here!" David called toward the kitchen. I heard the clatter of pots being set down, then quick footsteps across hardwood floors. Natalie appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel that probably cost more than the ones Helen and I used to buy at the discount store. She'd aged well, still the pretty woman David had fallen for in college, though her smile seemed calculated around the edges. "Alan, what a wonderful surprise." She leaned in for a quick hug that felt genuine this time. David said you might not be able to make it tonight." Her smile widened as she took in my expensive suit, the confident posture. "You look absolutely fantastic. The newspapers weren't exaggerating about your success, were they? $27 million. That's just incredible." "Thank you, Natalie. You look lovely as always." I paused, watching both their faces carefully. It's been quite a year. The tech investment paid off better than I ever imagined. I'm grateful to be here with my family to celebrate. "We're thrilled you're here," Natalie said, her voice carrying genuine warmth for the first time in years. "Aren't we, David? It's about time we all got back together." David leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped together. "Absolutely. I've been following your story in the news, Dad. I'm so proud of what you've accomplished. After everything you went through with Mom and then, well, I know we lost touch, but seeing you succeed like this—" I looked directly at both of them as I said this, watching their faces. They were both leaning forward slightly, their eyes fixed on my every word. "Well," David sat back in his chair, his eyes bright. "We're so glad you could finally make it, Dad." The warmth in his voice, the use of that word, Dad, after so many years of silence, nearly undid me. But I had a role to play, and everything depended on playing it perfectly. I smiled and reached into my jacket pocket. "Before we eat, I wanted to give you something." I pulled out the sealed envelope from First National Bank and placed it carefully beside David's dinner plate. The thick paper bore the familiar logo that both David and Natalie would immediately recognize. The bank where they kept their own accounts, where David's mortgage was held, where Natalie made her mysterious monthly deposits. David's eyes lit up with curiosity. "Dad, is this—" He glanced at Natalie, who was leaning forward, her wine glass forgotten as she stared at the envelope. "A little something for the family," I said simply, watching their faces carefully. "Something I thought you should have. Something that will explain a lot about our family's financial situation." The envelope sat there between us like a promise, its bank seal catching the candlelight. Both David and Natalie were staring at it with expressions of barely contained hope. "What is it?" David's eyes stayed fixed on the envelope as he spoke. "Something we'll get to after dinner," I said, enjoying the way their eyes kept drifting back to the envelope. "First, I'd love to meet my granddaughter. Is Emma around? I brought her something special, too." I pulled out a beautifully wrapped gift. Not the cheap puzzle from my original plan, but an expensive art set I'd chosen specifically for an 8-year-old girl who I hoped would become the artist her grandmother had been. The contrast between this thoughtful, expensive gift and the years of absence was intentional and stark. Natalie and David exchanged a look that lasted just a fraction too long, the kind of silent communication that happens between couples who've learned to speak without words. "She's upstairs playing," Natalie said, her voice suddenly careful. "Emma, come down here, sweetheart. Grandpa's here." "Actually, I think she's coming down now," David added unnecessarily, and sure enough, I heard small feet thundering down the stairs with the unmistakable energy of childhood. 8-year-old Emma bounded into the room with all the enthusiasm of a child on Christmas Eve, her dark hair in pigtails tied with red ribbons that matched her Christmas dress perfectly. She stopped short when she saw me, tilting her head with the unfiltered curiosity only children possess. Her eyes were Helen's eyes, the same warm brown that had captured my heart 35 years ago. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "Emma, sweetheart," David said, his voice gentle and proud. "This is your grandfather, my dad, the one we've told you about." Emma studied me with the serious expression children wear when they're trying to make sense of adult situations. Then, with the devastating honesty that only children possess, she looked directly at her mother and said, "Mommy, is this the man who gives you the money?" The room went dead silent. Natalie's face went from flushed to ashen, her hand gripping the back of the couch so tightly her knuckles went white. David's head turned slowly toward his wife, his eyebrows drawing together as his mouth opened slightly in confusion. And Emma, bless her innocent heart, looked around at all the adult faces with growing confusion about what she'd said wrong. "Emma, sweetie," Natalie's voice came out in a higher pitch, the words tumbling over each other. "Why don't you go back upstairs for a few minutes? Daddy and Grandpa need to talk." but the damage was done. David was staring at his wife now, then at me, then back at Natalie. I could see the wheels turning in his engineer's mind, processing the implications of his daughter's innocent question. "What money, Emma? What man?" His voice carried a dangerous quiet that I recognized from his childhood. David had always gotten quieter when he was truly angry, not louder. I realized this was my moment. The truth was going to come out anyway. Emma had seen to that with her guileless honesty, but I could control how it came out, shape the narrative in a way that would help David understand not just what had been happening, but why. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for the envelope I'd placed beside David's plate. The bank seal caught the light as I picked it up. "I think," I said quietly, "it's time we opened this." David and Natalie both stared at the envelope, but their expressions were completely different now. David looked confused and increasingly concerned. Natalie looked absolutely terrified, as if the envelope contained her death sentence rather than the generous gift she'd been hoping for. "What money, Natalie?" David's words came out soft and measured, each syllable carefully controlled. I recognized that tone from his teenage years when he'd caught his friends lying about broken windows or missing homework, the quiet before the storm. Natalie's laugh came out high and artificial, the sound of someone scrambling for purchase on a crumbling cliff. "Oh, honey, you know how kids are. Emma probably saw someone at the grocery store giving me change or something. Children mix up stories all the time." She reached down to smooth Emma's hair, but her hand was trembling slightly. "Don't you, sweetheart? You probably just saw Mommy talking to the cashier at the store." But Emma shook her head vigorously. "No, Mommy. The man with the gray hair who comes to our house sometimes, he gives you the white envelopes with money inside. I saw you counting it in the kitchen last week when you thought I was watching TV." She turned to me with bright, curious eyes. "Are you him? You have the same gray hair." David sat down heavily in his recliner, the same brown leather chair I'd bought him for his 30th birthday through another anonymous gift, his hands gripping the armrests. His forehead creased into deep lines as he stared first at Emma, then at Natalie, then at me, as if trying to solve an equation that kept changing variables. Natalie. The name came out barely above a whisper, but something in David's tone made the air in the room feel thinner. His hands rested flat on the armrests of his chair, fingers spread wide like he was trying to ground himself. "Sit down, now." "David, this is ridiculous." Natalie's words tumbled out too fast, her pitch climbing with each syllable. "You're going to believe an 8-year-old's imagination over your own wife?" She settled onto the very edge of the couch cushion, her body angled toward the door as if calculating the distance to escape. "Emma, honey, why don't you go upstairs and play with your new dollhouse for a while? The grown-ups need to have a boring conversation." "The dollhouse Santa brought me?" Emma asked innocently. "The one that was sitting by the tree this morning with no tag on it?" She looked at me again, her head tilted. "Did you bring me that too, like the money for Mommy?" My carefully constructed plan was spinning beyond my control, but in the best possible way. I hadn't expected Emma to be quite so observant, quite so willing to share what she'd seen. Children, I was learning, made terrible co-conspirators when it came to keeping adults' secrets. "Emma," Natalie's voice had climbed another octave. "That's enough. Go to your room, now." The sharpness in her tone made Emma's eyes fill with tears. This was my granddaughter, and watching someone snap at her, even her own mother, awakened something fierce and paternal that I thought I'd lost forever. "Don't talk to her that way," I said, my own voice carrying an edge I hadn't intended. "She's telling the truth, which is more than I can say for everyone else in this room." David stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Dad," he said, and for the first time in 14 years, the word didn't sound angry when it came out of his mouth. It sounded confused, maybe even hopeful. "I think you should sit down too. I think we all need to have a conversation about what's been going on here." I carefully opened the bank envelope, knowing that this moment would change everything. Inside were copies of bank statements from Natalie's account at First National Bank, spanning 14 years. Each statement showed the same pattern: regular deposits of $2,000 from Alan Walker, month after month, year after year. Natalie's hand froze halfway to her wine glass as she saw me reaching for the envelope. Her face went white as she realized what I was about to reveal. "David," I said quietly, my voice cutting through the tension like a knife through silk, "your daughter is telling the truth. I have been giving Natalie money for 8 years now, ever since Emma was born. Before that, it was 6 years of paying your mortgage, your car insurance, your medical bills when things got tight." I spread the bank statements across the dinner table, the evidence undeniable in black and white. Every month, $2,000, sometimes more when there were emergencies. Emma's preschool tuition when you wanted to get her into that Montessori program. The new roof after the storm in 2017 when your insurance didn't cover everything. Your emergency room visit when you broke your ribs playing softball and couldn't work for 3 weeks. David's eyebrows drew together, his mouth opening slightly as if to ask a question. Then his eyes widened, darting between the bank statements and Natalie's face. The color slowly drained from his cheeks, his face going pale as the reality of what he was seeing hit him. His hands began to tremble as he picked up the papers, scanning the dates, the amounts, the undeniable pattern of support. That's not possible. Natalie told me that money came from her freelance design work. She said she'd gotten some big corporate clients, that business was booming, and she was finally making the kind of money she'd always dreamed of. "Show him the bank statements, Dad," Emma piped up helpfully. "Mommy keeps them in the kitchen drawer. She showed me the numbers once and said it was why we could go to Disney World last summer." Natalie's shoulders hunched forward as if she were trying to make herself smaller, disappearing into the couch cushions. Her eyes darted between David and me, then toward the hallway, then back again. She wrapped her arms around herself, fingers digging into her own sleeves. "Emma, that's enough. Go to your room. Now." The sharpness in her voice made Emma's eyes fill with tears again. "Don't talk to her that way," I said, standing up from my chair. "She's telling the truth, which is more than I can say for everyone else in this room." I turned to David, who was staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. "Son, I never stopped being your father. I never stopped taking care of your family. I just did it quietly, through channels I thought you'd accept, because that was the only way you'd let me help." The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. 14 years, David whispered, his voice barely audible. "You've been, but you were supposed to be the one who abandoned us. After Mom died, you were supposed to be the one who chose work over family, money over love." He looked at Natalie with a growing realization dawning in his eyes. "That's what you told me. That's the story I've been believing all this time." David stood up so suddenly that his chair rocked backward. His hands were shaking as he ran them through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was trying to process something too big for his young mind to handle. 14 years, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper, each word forced out like he was lifting something impossibly heavy. 14 years of thinking my father didn't care about me, didn't want anything to do with his granddaughter. "David, please, let me explain." Natalie started, but he held up a hand that stopped her mid-sentence. His palm was rigid, fingers spread wide like he was trying to physically block her words from reaching him. "Explain what, exactly?" His voice was gaining strength, but his shoulders were hunched forward as if protecting himself from a blow. "Explain how you've been taking money from my father for nearly a decade and a half while telling me he abandoned us? Explain how you've been lying to my face every single day about where our financial stability came from?" He turned to look at me, and I saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. "Dad, the night Mom died, you didn't choose work over being there, did you?" My chest tightened, and I had to swallow twice before I could speak. "No, son. I was at the hospital. I was holding your mother's hand when she passed. I only left to handle the funeral arrangements and call your school to let them know what happened." "But Natalie said—" David's voice cracked, and he pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes. "She said you went back to work the next day, that you cared more about a construction deadline than being with your family during the worst time of our lives. I went to work to quit," I said, my throat so tight the words came out rough and strained. "To tell my boss I wouldn't be coming back, that I needed time to take care of my son who'd just lost his mother. But when I got home that evening, you'd already retreated to your room and wouldn't speak to me. For months I tried everything: family counseling, grief support groups, just sitting outside your bedroom door talking to the silence. But you blamed me for not being able to save her. For all those years I worked long hours while she was getting sicker." Natalie made a sound that was half sob, half protest, her hands fluttering to her throat like she was trying to keep the words from escaping. "You don't understand. When I first met David in college, he was still so angry, so closed off from his father. He told me how you'd worked all the time while his mother was dying, how you couldn't even be there emotionally when she needed you most. He said you two barely spoke after the funeral. I was trying to help him heal from that trauma." "I needed my father," David exploded, his face flushing red from his collar to his hairline. Emma, who had been sitting quietly on the stairs where she'd retreated during the adult conversation, flinched at the volume, her small hands covering her ears. He immediately lowered his voice, but his entire body remained coiled like a spring. "I was 17 years old, Natalie. I'd just lost my mother. And yes, I was angry. I was angry at the world, at God, at cancer. And yes, at Dad for all those years he worked late while Mom got sicker. But I was 17 and hurting, and I needed time to grieve and heal. Instead, you convinced me that cutting him off completely was the answer. That's not... I was protecting you. You were so angry, so hurt. I thought distance would help you heal." "Distance from what? From the man who apparently never stopped taking care of me, even when I was too stubborn and hurt to realize it?" David's laugh was bitter and hollow, echoing off the walls like a gunshot. "Tell me something, Natalie. When did the money start coming? When did my estranged father start sending us checks even though I'd refused to speak to him for years?" Natalie's silence was answer enough, but David pressed on, his voice climbing with each word. "It was right away, wasn't it? Even when you took me away, even when you told me he didn't care, he was still making sure we were okay." I cleared my throat. "The first payment was for your college tuition. You'd gotten into state, remember? But the scholarship only covered part of it. When Natalie reached out and said you were struggling financially but were too proud to ask me directly, I started sending money through her." I looked at my son, seeing the boy I'd taught to throw a football in the man who was staring at me with dawning horror. "She told me you still couldn't handle direct contact with me, but that you were grateful for the help. Maybe someday, when you are ready, we could try to rebuild our relationship." David's coffee mug hit the table with a sharp clink, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "College," he said, his voice hollow as an empty well. "Natalie, you told me your parents paid for college. You said they'd saved up for years specifically for my education. They helped. How much?" The vein in his temple was pulsing visibly now. "How much of my life has been funded by the father you convinced me didn't love me?" Emma's small voice floated down from the staircase, cutting through the adult tension with the clarity only children possess. "Daddy, why is everyone crying?" David looked up at his daughter and struggled to compose himself. His jaw worked silently for several seconds before he could speak, the effort of controlling his emotions visible in every line of his face. "Emma, sweetheart, can you go up to your room for a little while? Take your new art set with you. Daddy needs to talk to Mommy and Grandpa about some grown-up things." "Is Grandpa really Grandpa?" Emma asked, her 8-year-old mind cutting straight to the heart of things with the kind of directness adults spend years learning to avoid. "The man who brings the money?" "Yes, baby. He's really your grandfather." David's voice broke on the words, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of 14 years of lies had finally become too much to bear. "He's been your grandfather all along." After Emma's footsteps faded up the stairs, David turned back to Natalie with an expression I'd never seen before. The love that had been there moments before had been replaced by something that looked like the death of trust. "I want to see all the bank statements," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the kind of authority that comes from a man who's finally stopped believing the lies he's been told. "Every deposit, every transfer, every single lie you've been living on for the past 14 years. "David, you're being dramatic." "I'm being dramatic?" His voice rose again, then dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "Natalie, you've stolen 14 years from me. 14 years of knowing my father, of Emma knowing her grandfather, of believing lies about whether he even wanted a relationship with us. And you want to call me dramatic?" Natalie stood up abruptly. Tears were streaming down her face now, leaving dark tracks through her carefully applied makeup. "Fine. Yes, he sent money. Yes, I lied about where it came from. But you have no idea what it was like, David. You were so angry after your mother died, so impossible to reach. You blamed everyone, including him. I was trying to protect you from more pain. By lying to me? By giving you space to heal from your trauma? By making sure you had a stable life without the complication of a relationship that was clearly toxic for you at the time?" Her voice was climbing toward hysteria now, her hands gesturing wildly. "Do you think it was easy for me? Do you think I enjoyed being the go-between, managing his money while watching you struggle with abandonment issues and unresolved grief? Is that what you told yourself all these years?" I stood up slowly, my chest tightening with a cold, hard knot of anger that I hadn't felt in years. That I was sending money out of guilt instead of love? Natalie's eyes flashed with something that looked almost like hatred. "Weren't you? Wasn't it easier to write checks than to actually fight for your son? Wasn't it simpler to let me handle everything while you went off and built your business empire?" "I fought for him every day," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I called every week for the first 2 years after college. You told me he still wasn't ready to talk. I sent birthday cards, Christmas presents, and graduation gifts. You said he returned them to you unopened, that seeing my handwriting upset him too much. I believed you because I knew how much pain he was in, how angry he'd been after Helen died. You tried to reach out to me?" David's voice was small, like a child's. "Every holiday, every birthday, every major milestone in your life. Natalie said you were doing better but still couldn't handle direct contact with me. She said the guilt about how things ended between us was eating you alive, that you wanted to reconcile someday but needed more time to heal." "That's—" David sat down heavily again, his head in his hands, fingers digging into his scalp like he was trying to physically hold his thoughts together. "That's not what happened. I never said any of that. After Mom died, yes, I was angry and I pulled away from you. But by my junior year of college, I was ready to try to talk things through. Natalie said she'd reached out to you, that you were too busy with your new business ventures to deal with teenage drama from the past. She said you'd moved on with your life and didn't want to be reminded of the pain. I pulled out my phone and opened the app I'd had Marcus help me set up last month. A digital archive of 14 years of attempted contact. I have records, son. Every attempted phone call, every returned letter, every legal document that proves I never stopped trying to reach you." The silence in the room was deafening. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the timer on the oven beeping, reminding us that there was supposed to be a Christmas dinner happening here. Instead, we were sitting in the wreckage of 14 years of carefully constructed lies. David looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes that held a mix of pain and something that might have been wonderful. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why did you keep sending money through her if you knew she was lying to me?" "Because," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I'd intended, my throat raw with emotion I'd been holding back for too long. "It was the only way I could take care of my family. And no matter how much you hated me for failing your mother, no matter how much our relationship was broken, you were still my son. Emma was still my granddaughter. If sending money through Natalie was the only way I could help you heal and build a stable life, then that's what I was going to do. I kept hoping that someday when you were ready, she'd tell me you wanted to try talking again." But I wasn't finished. There was one more revelation, one more piece of the puzzle that would complete the picture of exactly how thoroughly Natalie had betrayed both of us. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the second envelope, the one I'd been saving for this exact moment. My fingers trembled slightly as I set it on the coffee table between us. "Because, son, I needed you to see what I've been seeing for the past 2 years." David picked up the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Marcus had been thorough in his documentation. Photos of Natalie meeting a man at coffee shops, their conversations intense and intimate. Photos of her at expensive restaurants, her hand intertwined with someone else's across candlelit tables. Photos of her entering and leaving hotel rooms, always with the same man. And at the bottom of the stack, a different kind of photo entirely. Bank records showing that Natalie had been transferring portions of my monthly payments to a separate account, one that she shared with someone named Richard Hartwell. "What is this?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he held up a picture of Natalie having dinner with a man I didn't recognize, their hands intertwined across a candlelit table. "Marcus took that 6 months ago," I said, my throat tight with the difficulty of what I was about to reveal. "The man's name is Richard Hartwell. He's a real estate developer from Portland. Natalie's been seeing him every few weeks when she tells you she's visiting her sister in Seattle." David's face went pale so quickly I was afraid he might faint. His knuckles went white as he gripped the photograph, his hands shaking with the force of his grip. "Have you been following us?" "I've been having her follow," I corrected, gesturing toward Natalie, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. "For 2 years, ever since I started suspecting that the money wasn't the only thing she was lying about." Natalie made a sound like a wounded animal, her hands flying to cover her mouth as if she could somehow take back the evidence of her betrayal. "You bastard! You sick, vindictive bastard!" "Am I wrong?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the way my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Is Richard Hartwell just a friend? Are those hotel receipts in the bottom of the envelope just business meetings?" David was rifling through the papers now, his face cycling through expressions too complex to name. When he looked up at Natalie, something fundamental had died behind his eyes. "How long?" "David, I can explain." Natalie's voice came out strangled, her hands reaching toward him before falling back to her sides in defeat. "How long, Natalie?" The question came out like a growl, low and dangerous, carrying 14 years of accumulated betrayal and pain. 3 years, she whispered, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the confession was physically crushing her. "But it's not what you think. Richard and I, we understand each other. He knows about the pressure I've been under, managing your relationship with your father, keeping this family together. By lying to me about everything that mattered?" David's voice cracked on the last word, and he pressed his lips together so hard they went white. "By building our entire life on deception? By protecting you?" Natalie's voice rose to near hysteria, her whole body trembling now with the force of her desperation. "By making sure you had stability and love and a family that wasn't broken by grief and abandonment issues. Do you have any idea how hard it's been, being the buffer between you and him, managing his money while trying to help you heal?" "Is that what you called it when you deposited my checks?" I stood up slowly, my chest tightening with a cold, hard knot of anger. "When you paid for your daughter's education, your family's roof, your husband's medical bills?" David was staring at the bank records now, his engineer's mind processing the numbers, the dates, the undeniable pattern of deception. "You've been taking portions of Dad's money and giving it to your boyfriend," he said, his voice hollow. "You've been funding your affair with my father's love for me." "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" David stood up and walked to the window, his shoulders rigid with the kind of pain that goes bone deep. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed and haunted by the revelation that his entire adult life had been built on lies. "Dad," he said without turning around, his breath fogging the window as he spoke, "when you said you had a plan tonight, was exposing Natalie's affair part of it?" The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications about my motives and methods. I looked at this woman who had stolen 14 years from me, who had built her life on my money while poisoning my son against me, who had been cheating on her husband while playing the role of devoted wife and mother. And I realized that my answer to this question would define the kind of man I was, and the kind of relationship I might have with my son going forward. "No," I said finally, the words scraping my throat raw. "The affair was something I discovered by accident. I hired Marcus to document the financial lies, not to investigate Natalie's personal life. But when he saw patterns, unexplained absences, inconsistencies in her stories about where she'd been, he felt obligated to dig deeper." I paused, watching David's reflection in the window, seeing the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "I've been debating for months whether to tell you." "Why did you decide to tell me tonight?" "Because," I said, and my voice came out rough with 14 years of suppressed emotion, I love you too much to let you build your life on more lies. You deserve to know the truth about your father, and you deserve to know the truth about your wife." David turned around slowly, and for the first time since he was a teenager, I saw my son looking at me with something that might have been respect. His eyes were red-rimmed, but there was a new clarity in them, as if a fog that had been clouding his vision for years had finally lifted. "And what about Emma? What happens to her in all this?" It was the question I'd been dreading, the one that kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling. My chest tightened as I thought about my granddaughter upstairs, innocent and trusting, about to have her world turned upside down. "That's not my decision to make," I said carefully. "That's between you and Natalie. But Emma deserves honesty too, David. She deserves to know her grandfather, and she deserves parents who don't build their relationship on deception." Natalie had been sitting in silence through this exchange, but now she stood up abruptly, her movements jerky and aggressive like a marionette with tangled strings. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp with defeated rage, each word fired like a bullet. "You want the truth? Here's the truth. Yes, I kept you away from David. Yes, I lied about the money. Yes, I've been seeing Richard. But everything I did because David was healing and moving forward with his life. He was happier building a new future than he would have been dragging up all that old pain and guilt about his mother's death." She grabbed her purse from the side table, her movements sharp and violent, shoving things inside with enough force to tear the fabric. "You want your son back, Alan? Congratulations. You've got him. But don't pretend this is about love. This is about winning. This is about proving that your money and your private investigators and your 14 years of patience can buy you anything you want, including forgiveness." "Where are you going?" David asked, his voice hollow as an empty shell. "To Richard's," she said, not bothering to look back, her hand already on the doorknob. "At least he's honest about what he wants from me." The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the Christmas ornaments on the nearby tree, the delicate glass baubles tinkling like wind chimes in a storm. In the silence that followed, I could hear Emma's footsteps moving around upstairs, the innocent sound of a child playing, oblivious to the fact that her world had just fundamentally changed forever. David and I stood looking at each other across a living room that suddenly felt enormous and empty. Two men who had spent 14 years as strangers finally seeing each other clearly. "Dad," he said finally, his voice barely holding together. "I need time. This is too much. 14 years of believing one thing and now—" He sat down hard in his chair, hands covering his face. "I don't even know what's real anymore." "I understand," I said, though every fiber of me wanted to rush toward him. "This isn't something you can process in one evening. I keep thinking, all those birthdays when I thought you'd forgotten me. Christmas mornings when I told Emma her grandfather didn't care about her." His voice broke. "And you were there all along, just hidden." "You don't have to trust me yet," I told him, my own voice rough with unshed tears. "Trust has to be earned back, on both sides. I should have fought harder to reach you directly instead of going through Natalie." Upstairs, a small voice called out, "Daddy, I'm scared. Why was everyone yelling?" David looked up at me, his eyes red and lost. I don't know how to explain this to her. Her whole world just changed and she doesn't even know it yet. "We don't have to explain everything tonight," I said carefully. Maybe I could just be Grandpa who came for Christmas. The rest can wait until you're ready." David studied my face for a long moment. Would you like to meet your granddaughter properly? Just like her grandfather? Nothing more complicated than that for now." I had to clear my throat twice before I could speak. "I would love that more than anything." As we climbed the stairs together, David said quietly, "I'm going to need help. Therapy, probably. And Emma will too when all this comes out. I can't do this alone." "You won't be alone," I promised. "Whatever you need, however long it takes." Emma's room was a wonderland of childhood imagination. When she saw both of us in her doorway, her earlier fear melted into cautious curiosity. "Is everything okay, Daddy?" "Everything's going to be okay, sweetheart," David said, though his voice still shook. "Grandpa came to visit us for Christmas. Would you like him to read you a story?" That night, after Emma fell asleep to a simple fairy tale about a princess and her father, David and I sat in his kitchen drinking coffee in a silence that felt different, not comfortable, but not hostile either. "I keep thinking about Mom," David said finally. "What she'd say about all this?" "She'd say that healing takes time," I replied, "and that anger is just love with nowhere to go." David's laugh was shaky. "She always did have the right words." He paused. "I want to try, Dad. I want to rebuild something between us, but I need to go slow. I need to understand how we got here before I can figure out where we're going." "However long it takes," I repeated. "And Emma comes first. Whatever happens between you and me, she can't get hurt in the crossfire." "Agreed." From the monitor on the counter, we heard Emma's drowsy voice. "Good night, Daddy. Good night, Grandpa." David's breath caught, and when I looked at him, his eyes were bright with tears. "She called you Grandpa?" "Yeah," I whispered. "She did." For the first time in 14 years, sitting in my son's kitchen with the possibility of healing stretching out before us, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. Hope. Not the fairy tale ending I might have imagined, but something better. The promise of truth, the chance to build something real. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the past in white. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations, custody lawyers, and the slow work of rebuilding trust. But tonight, I was a grandfather who had read his granddaughter a bedtime story, and my son had called me Dad without anger in his voice. Sometimes the best gifts aren't wrapped in paper at all. Sometimes they're wrapped in time, patience, and the courage to start over from the very beginning. As I prepared to leave that night, David walked me to the door. "Dad," he said, his hand on the doorknob, "thank you for never giving up, for waiting, for loving us even when we didn't deserve it." "You always deserved it," I told him, my voice thick with emotion. "Every single day for 14 years, you deserved to be loved." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I know that now, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." "We have time to make up for it," I said, "all the time in the world." And as I drove home through the snowy Christmas night, I realized that while I'd set out to reclaim my family, what I'd actually done was give them the greatest gift I could offer: the truth. Everything else would follow from there. If you found this story moving, I'd be grateful if you could like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts about family, forgiveness, and second chances in the comments below. Sometimes the longest roads lead us exactly where we need to be, but the journey to healing is never quite finished.